The Adventures of Pinocchio, written by Collodi. Chapter 1. How it came to pass that Master Cherry, the carpenter, found a piece of wood that laughed and cried like a child. There was once upon a time a king, my little readers will instantly exclaim. No, children, you are wrong. There was once upon a time a piece of wood. This wood was not valuable. It was only a common log, like those that are burned in winter in the stoves and fireplaces to make a cheerful blaze and warm the rooms. I cannot say how it came about, but the fact is that one fine day this piece of wood was lying in the shop of an old carpenter of the name of Master Antonio. He was, however, called by everyone Master Cherry, on account of the end of his nose, which was always as red and polished as a ripe cherry. No sooner had Master Cherry set his eyes on the piece of wood than his face beamed with delight, and rubbing his hands together with satisfaction, he said softly to himself, "This wood has come at the right moment. It will just do to make the leg of a little table." Having said this, he immediately took a sharp axe with which to remove the bark and the rough surface. Just, however, as he was going to give the first stroke, he remained with his arm suspended in the air, for he heard a very small voice saying imploringly, "Do not strike me so hard." Picture to yourselves the astonishment of good old Master Cherry. He turned his terrified eyes all around the room to try to discover where the little voice could possibly have come from. But he saw nobody. He looked under the bench. Nobody. He looked into a cupboard that was always shut. Nobody. He looked into a basket of shavings and sawdust. Nobody. He even opened the door of the shop and gave a glance into the street, and still nobody. Who, then, could it be? "I see how it is," he said, laughing and scratching his wig. "Evidently that little voice was all my imagination. Let us set to work again." And, taking up the axe, he struck a tremendous blow on the piece of wood. "Oh, oh, you have hurt me," cried the same little voice dolefully. This time Master Cherry was petrified. His eyes started out of his head with fright. His mouth remained open, and his tongue hung out almost to the end of his chin, like a mask on a fountain. As soon as he had recovered the use of his speech, he began to say, stuttering and trembling with fear, "But what on earth can that little voice have come from that said, 'Oh, oh'? There is certainly not a living soul. It is possible that this piece of wood can have learned to cry and to lament like a child? I cannot believe it. This piece of wood, here it is, a log for fuel like all the others, and thrown on the fire it would have sufficed to boil a saucepan of beans. How, then, can anyone be hidden inside? If anyone is hidden inside, so much the worse for him. I will settle him at once." So saying, he seized the poor piece of wood and commenced to beating it without mercy against the walls of the room. Then he stopped and listened to see if he could hear any little voice lamenting. He waited 2 minutes, nothing. 5 minutes, nothing. 10 minutes, still nothing. "I see how it is," he then said, forcing himself to laugh and pushing up his wig. "Evidently that little voice that said, 'Oh, oh,' was all my imagination. Let us set to work again." But as all the same he was in a great fright, he tried to sing to give himself a little courage. Putting the axe aside, he took his plane, to plane and polish the bit of wood. But whilst he was running it up and down, he heard the same little voice say, laughing, "Have done! You are tickling me all over." This time poor Master Cherry fell down as if he had been struck by lightning. When he at last opened his eyes, he found himself seated on the floor. His face was quite changed, and the end of his nose, instead of being crimson, as it was nearly always, had become blue with fright. Chapter 2. Master Cherry makes a present of the piece of wood to his friend Geppetto, who takes it to make for himself a wonderful puppet that shall know how to dance and to fence, and to leap like an acrobat. At that moment, someone came knocking at the door. "Come in," said the carpenter, without having the strength to rise to his feet. A lively little old man immediately walked into the shop. His name was Geppetto, but when the boys of the neighborhood wished to put him in a passion, they called him by the nickname of Polendina, because his yellow wig greatly resembled a pudding made of Indian corn. Geppetto was very fiery. Woe to him who called him Polendina. He became furious, and there was no holding him. "Good day, Master Antonio," said Geppetto. "What are you doing there on the floor?" "I am teaching the alphabet to the ants." "Much good may that do you. What has brought you to me, neighbor Geppetto?" "My legs. But to say the truth, Master Antonio, I am come to ask a favor of you." "Here I am, ready to serve you," replied the carpenter, getting on to his knees. "This morning an idea came into my head. Let us hear it. I thought I would make a beautiful wooden puppet, but a wonderful puppet that should know how to dance, to fence, and to leap like an acrobat. With this puppet, I would travel about the world to earn a piece of bread and a glass of wine. What do you think?" "Bravo, Polendina!" exclaimed the same little voice, and it was impossible to say where it came from. Hearing himself called Polendina, Geppetto became as red as a turkey cocked from rage, and turning to the carpenter, he said in a fury, "Why do you insult me?" "Who insults you? You called me Polendina." "It was not I." "Would you have it, then, that it was I?" "It was you, I say." "No." "Yes." "No." "Yes." But becoming more and more angry from words, they came to blows, and flying at each other, they bit and fought and scratched manfully. When the fight was over, Master Antonio was in possession of Geppetto's yellow wig, and Geppetto discovered that the gray wig belonging to the carpenter had remained between his teeth. "Give me back my wig," screamed Master Antonio, "and you, return me mine, and let us make friends." The two old men, having each other his own wig, shook hands and swore that they would remain friends to the end of their lives. "Well then, neighbor Geppetto," said the carpenter, to prove that peace was made, "what is the favor that you wish of me?" "I want a little piece of wood to make my puppet. Will you give me some?" Master Antonio was delighted, and he immediately went to the bench and brought the piece of wood that had caused him so much fear. But just as he was going to give it to his friend, the piece of wood gave a shake, and wriggling violently out of his hands, struck with all its force against the dried-up shins of poor Geppetto. "Ah! Is that the courteous way in which you make your presents, Master Antonio? You have almost lamed me. I hear to you that it was not me. Then you would have it that it was I? The wood is entirely to blame. I know that it was the wood, but it was you that hit my leg with it." "I did not hit you with it." "Liar! Geppetto, don't insult me, or I will call you Polendina." "Ass! Polendina! Donkey! Polendina! Baboon! Polendina!" On hearing himself called Polendina for the third time, Geppetto, blind with rage, fell upon the carpenter, and they fought desperately. When the battle was over, Master Antonio had 2 more scratches on his nose, and his adversary had 2 buttons too few on his waistcoat. Their accounts being thus squared, they shook hands and swore to remain good friends for the rest of their lives. Geppetto carried off his fine piece of wood, and thanking Master Antonio, returned limping to his house. Chapter 3. Geppetto, having returned home, begins at once to make a puppet, to which he gives the name of Pinocchio, the first tricks played by the puppet. Geppetto lived in a small ground-floor room that was lighted only from the staircase. The furniture could not have been simpler: a bad chair, a poor bed, and a broken-down table. At the end of the room there was a fireplace with a lighted fire, but the fire was painted, and by the fire was a painted saucepan that was boiling cheerfully and sending out a cloud of painted smoke that looked exactly like real smoke. As soon as he reached home, Geppetto took his tools and set to work to cut out and model his puppet. "What name shall I give him?" he said to himself. "I think I will call him Pinocchio. It is a name that will bring him luck. I once knew a whole family so called. There was Pinocchio the father, Pinocchia the mother, Pinocchia the children, and all of them did well. The richest of them was a beggar." Having found a name for his puppet, he began to work in good earnest, and he first made his hair, then his forehead, and then his eyes. When the eyes were finished, imagine his astonishment when he perceived that they moved and looked fixedly at him. Geppetto, seeing himself stared at by those two wooden eyes, took it almost in bad part, and said in an angry voice, "Wicked wooden eyes, why do you look at me?" No one answered. He then proceeded to carve the nose, but no sooner had he made it than it began to grow. And it grew and grew and grew until a few minutes it had become an immense nose that seemed as if it would never end. Poor Geppetto tried himself out with cutting it off, but the more he cut and shortened it, the longer did the impertinent nose become. The mouth was not even completed when it began to laugh and deride him. "Stop laughing," said Geppetto, provoked, but he might as well have spoken to the wall. "Stop laughing, I say," he roared in a threatening tone. The mouth then ceased laughing, but put out its tongue as far as it would go. Geppetto, not to spoil his handiwork, pretended not to see, and continued his labors. After his mouth, he fashioned the chin, then the throat, then the shoulders, the stomach, the arms, and the hands. The hands were scarcely finished when Geppetto felt his wig snatched from his head. He turned round, and what did he see? He saw his yellow wig in the puppet's hand. "Pinocchio! Give me back my wig instantly!" But Pinocchio, instead of returning it, put it on his own head, and was in consequence nearly smothered. Geppetto, at this insolent and derisive behavior, felt sadder and more melancholy than he had ever been in his life before, and turning to Pinocchio, he said to him, "You young rascal, you are not yet completed, and you are already beginning to show want of respect to your father. That is bad, my boy, very bad." And he dried a tear. The legs and the feet remained to be done. When Geppetto had finished the feet, he received a kick on the point of his nose. "I deserved it," he said to himself. "I should have thought of it sooner. Now it is too late." He then took the puppet under his arms and placed him on the floor to teach him to walk. Pinocchio's legs were stiff, and he could not move, but Geppetto led him by the hand and showed him how to put one foot before the other. When the legs became flexible, Pinocchio began to walk by himself and to run about the room, until having gone out of the house door, he jumped into the street and escaped. Poor Geppetto rushed after him, but was not able to overtake him, for the rascal Pinocchio leapt in front of him like a hare, and knocking his wooden feet together against the pavement, made as much clatter as 20 pairs of peasants' clogs. "Stop him! Stop him!" shouted Geppetto, but the people in the street, seeing a wooden puppet running like a racehorse, stood still in astonishment. To look at it, and laughed, and laughed, and laughed, until it beats description. At last, as good luck would have it, a carabiner arrived, who, hearing the uproar, imagined that a colt had escaped from his master. Planting himself courageously with his legs apart in the middle of the road, he waited with the determined purpose of stopping him, and thus preventing the chance of worse disasters. When Pinocchio, still at some distance, saw the carabiner barricading the whole street, he endeavored to take him by surprise and to pass between his legs, but he failed signally. The carabiner, without disturbing himself in the least, caught him cleverly by the nose. It was an immense nose of ridiculous proportions that seemed made on purpose to be laid hold of by carabiners, and consigned him to Geppetto. Wishing to punish him, Geppetto intended to pull his ears at once, but imagine his feelings when he could not find them. And do you know the reason? It was that, in his hurry to model him, he had forgotten to make them. He then took him by the collar, and as he was leading him away, he said to him, shaking his head threateningly, We will go home at once, and as soon as we arrive, we will regulate our accounts. Never doubt it. At this announcement, Pinocchio threw himself on the ground and would not take another step. In the meanwhile, the crowd of idlers and inquisitive people began to assemble and to make a ring around them. Some of them said one thing, some another. Poor puppet, said several. It is right not to wish to return home. Who knows how Geppetto, that bad old man, will beat him? And the others added maliciously, Geppetto seems a good man, but with boys he is a regular tyrant. If that poor puppet is left in his hands, he is quite capable of tearing him to pieces. It ended in so much being said and done that the carabiner at last set Pinocchio at liberty and conducted Geppetto to prison. The poor old man, being ready with words to defend himself, cried like a calf, and he was being led away to prison, sobbed out, Wretched boy! And to think how I had labored to make him a well-conducted puppet. But it serves me right. I should have thought of it sooner. What happens afterwards is a story that really is past all belief, but I will relate it to you in the following chapters.